Hi, today I want to talk to you about a different kind of argument in Anselm. It's a response to a general worry that people have had about the nature of arguments for God's existence, whether they are a priori or a posteriori, whether they're based on anything like efficient or final or material or formal causation. It's that it looks like this gives us at best a philosopher's conception of God. God as a perfect being, God as a creator, and so on. But it seems to have little to do with God as God actually appears in real religious traditions. For one thing, it doesn't seem to have anything specific about it that really leads us to a Christian conception of God, or even a broadly Judeo-Christian conception, maybe not even a monotheistic conception, depending upon the nature of the argument. And so we might end up thinking that there's something about this that really is lacking. Moreover, worshippers in any religious tradition tend to treat their gods as beings with whom they have some kind of personal relationship. That is to say, their attitudes about God are de re. They are about that being. They're not de dicto, that is to say, just about any being that happens to fulfill a certain description. And so it might be that you have to appeal to the mayor's office, no matter who the mayor is, to accomplish a certain thing. That would be an example of, well, doing something that is de dicto in a sense. You don't care about the particular person who's the mayor. You just have to go through this step of applying to the mayor's office to get permission for something, let's say. But it's very different to say, no, it's Joe. I care whether Joe is going to like this. And that becomes something that is a de re attitude, something that is about that particular person. Well, you might think these arguments we've been advancing so far and considering and criticizing and so on, really, they just give us de dicto knowledge of God. They can't give us anything like de re knowledge of God. But that's what the religious believer really wants. That's what's the foundation for worship and praise and all of the other things that actually go into forming a real religion. When we think about the Christian conception of God, the situation is even more puzzling. Because after all, there are lots of features of the Christian conception that are, well, odd and not explained at all by simply saying God is the most perfect being, God is the ultimate creator and ground and architect of the universe. We end up saying, but wait a minute, Christianity adds a lot of stuff to that. Some of that involves doctrines of the Trinity. And in the course, we've spent a lot of time talking about different approaches to the problem of the Trinity, where we want to say God is both three and one, if we're committed to a Christian vision of God. But there are other problems too. After all, God is an all-powerful, all-knowing being, an entirely good being, according to the philosopher's conception. Well, why then did God actually create human beings in such a way that they would be tempted to sin? Why did God give us the freedom to sin? Why was it necessary, in other words, for the fall to take place? Why did God have to send his Son into the world to sacrifice himself for the sins of humanity? All of those things, at first glance, seem like puzzling things, and things that aren't going to be explained even a little bit, even if all those arguments from Anselm, Aquinas, Augustine, Paul, and so on are successful. So we might begin to think, look, in really talking about any religious tradition in a sense, but especially Christianity, there's a long way to go between establishing the existence or assuming the existence of God in that philosopher's sense and actually coming to a Christian conception of God and so justifying in any sense Christianity. This is the problem that Anselm addresses when he writes Cur Deus Homo, that is to say, why God became man. He's here addressing a specific theological problem. Why indeed was it important for God to become man? After all, there is really, if you had to summarize what is unique about the Christian conception of God, in one phrase, you might say, there is a being, there was a being that lived and walked on the earth who was both God and man, who was human and divine. The human plane and the divine plane intersected there. There was someone who was both human and divine, fully human, fully divine. How do we make sense of that? And why is that important? Why was that needed? Anselm is here trying to give us an argument, and I think largely an a priori argument, not just in favor of God, but in favor of a Christian conception of God. A conception of God as necessarily coming into contact in this way with the human plane through incarnation. And so here's how he sets it up. He begins with the question of the purpose of human beings. What is humanity for? You could look at Aristotle, who raises this kind of question in the Nicomachean Ethics. He says, we do things for reasons. I do some things for the sake of other things. I do some of those other things for the sake of yet further things, and so on. But not everything can be done for the sake of something else. Some things indeed are done for their own sakes. Now, a lot of things we value for their own sake as well as for the sake of something else. Health, for example, prosperity, respect. However, he says there's one thing we always value for its own sake and never for the sake of something else, namely happiness. Anselm responds to that and says, well, actually, I don't think that's right. I think happiness is itself instrumental in some way. The ultimate good for a human being is not just happiness. How does Aristotle come up with the question of happiness? How does he come up with his conception of virtue? He asks, what is the function of a human being? What are human beings for? And here, Anselm says, right question, but wrong answer. It isn't just rational activity. After all, that seems to imply that our goal is to engage in rational activity, whatever it is. We might all be sitting around playing Sudoku. On that conception, we're engaging in rational activity. But Anselm says that's not what's essential to a human being. No, understand a human being as the kind of being created by God that necessarily is fulfilled only through a relationship with God. So what is our ultimate purpose? What are we for? We are for communion with God. He says our highest good is not just happiness. It is not just living well. It is not some kind of cognizance of the form of the good in Plato's sense. No, it is something like being in communion with God. Seeking, yes, a unity with God in a sense, but of course we cannot become one with God exactly. Nevertheless, glorifying God, being in the presence of God, that's our highest purpose. Happiness, for Anselm, is only an intermediate answer. Our purpose is to know God, to love God, to be in community with God. What follows from that? Why does it matter? And why does it matter in particular that our purpose is something outside this world? Well, he said, suppose our ultimate end were something inside this world. Might be happiness, might be prosperity, might be love, whatever you think it is. Make it something inside this world. There are a number of problems with that. For one thing, it's not very stable. It might be that you're happy right now, but that happiness can be shattered. Something can happen, the black swan proverbially can come in and disrupt everything. Indeed, the past month has been a witness to that in the United States as I make this video, which is why I'm doing this instead of being in class. And so you might think, yes, insofar as I'm looking for happiness, that's pretty unstable. The same thing is true of love or a variety of other things in this world. It can be gained, it can be lost. It can be lost through no fault of your own, just through bad luck, through unfortunate circumstances, through unexpected events. And so those things are not very stable. They're also, for that reason, fleeting. They don't last forever. But a community with God, that is something that is highly stable. It is something that can last forever. And so Anselm is here giving us the kind of argument that Buddhist thinkers have given against desire and the fulfillment of desire as an ultimate human good. They've said, listen, you may get what you want, but it's awfully fleeting. You can easily end up failing to get what you want. Even if you get it, it may not last very long. Even if you get it, it may turn out not to be what you really wanted after all. And also a point Nietzsche later makes, it might turn out to be something that once you've achieved it, no longer has much meaning to you. And then it just becomes a question of what's the next thing. And so I think Anselm says only a community with God, only a relation to a being greater than yourself outside this world can give your life a meaning and can constitute an end that could actually give you something like the state of mind you seek in happiness, but in a way that is stable, a way that is not fleeting but eternal, a way that is ultimately fulfilling for you. That's your purpose. What about the universe itself? What is the purpose of the universe? Well, it's to promote that relationship, Anselm says. The whole point of creation is precisely to create that kind of community, for beings to be in community with God, to love God, to know God, to commune with God. And that sort of love is something, Anselm says, that requires free will. Suppose you were able to give someone a love potion and force them to fall in love with you. Would that be your ideal of a romantic relationship? Say, yes, as long as I keep the potion going, she's mad about me. This is awesome. Well, no, that's not the ideal. The ideal is for someone to love you because they want to love you. They themselves choose to love you. The ideal is that they get to know you and want to get to know you. Not that they're somehow pushed into it, forced into it, hypnotized into it, drugged into it. No, it's a question of people freely choosing to do it. That's what a true community is like. You can't just imprison a bunch of people, start talking to them and say, what community? No, they've got to choose to be part of that community. And so Anselm says it is vital for this purpose of the universe and for the development of that kind of relationship with humanity that God grants us free will. We have to be beings with free will in order to be able to enter into the kind of community with God that God desires, and that is our ultimate fulfillment. So we do have the choice. We have the choice to love God or to seek to flee from God, to get to know God or to ignore God, to seek communion with God or to avoid it. Now, that means we have the freedom to sin. And insofar as we sin, we are furthering ourselves from our ultimate aim. It is self-destructive for us to sin. It's also harmful to the very purpose, not only of our own lives, but of the universe. But we do have the freedom to do it, and we do. So in sinning, we go against our own purpose. We go against God's purpose. We go against the very purpose of the universe. And that's a pretty bad thing to do. So, in short, it's as if someone creates something wonderful for us. In fact, gives us life. Gives us everything around us that makes our life worthwhile. Gives us, indeed, an ultimate goal or purpose for our life, a meaning for our life. And then we reject it. That's quite a betrayal. Anselm says, that is a sin. In fact, that's what sin really is. It's a kind of betrayal of God, an ingratitude at the very least, but more than that. Something that really constitutes a violation of what ought to be an obligation to God. Well, how do you, in general, deal with that kind of failure to fulfill an obligation? How do you deal with betrayal? In the end, you seek forgiveness. We owe God an apology. We should seek forgiveness. We owe God a debt, in fact, he says. A debt. Initially a debt of gratitude, but now a debt that goes far beyond our general debt of gratitude. A debt that we've incurred ourselves by sinning, by rejecting our purpose, by rejecting the very structure and purpose of the universe that God has created for us. What is our debt? How great is that debt? Anselm says it is huge. It is really infinite. The gap between us and our finite capacities and God, who is infinite, is an infinite gap. It is infinitely large. Our debt is infinitely large. We, being finite beings, cannot possibly repay it. That way. Anselm says, look, we still haven't gone far enough to explain the necessity of God becoming man. But we've got the key factor. We, finite beings, owe an infinite debt. We cannot possibly pay it. We're finite beings. Our bank account is finitely large. However large it is, the debt we owe is infinite. We can't do it. Only God is infinite, so only God can pay the debt. Only God can forgive the debt. Here there are different theories of the atonement. I don't want to get into the details of that. People have argued that maybe we don't, in the end, have a firmly adequate theory of the atonement within Christianity. Maybe that's true. Anyway, for now, forget exactly how we want to phrase that. But only God is capable of putting us in a position, making us whole again, because of the infinite nature of the debt. Because God is infinite. We, being finite, can't possibly do it. On the other hand, suppose God were to do it. Suppose God were simply to forgive us. Anselm says that wouldn't do it. Why? Because that's not just. I mean, we deserve punishment. We deserve to actually owe that. That was a debt legitimately incurred. We really owe it. And so, For someone just to forgive the debt, that's not right, that's not fair. And so Anselm says, I think that is something that it doesn't make any sense for God to do by God's self, because after all, God is a just being. God is a perfect being, so God is perfectly just. God is not going to take a being that is infinitely in debt and simply wish the debt away. The debt is real. At best, God could ignore the debt, but the debt would still be there. So, how could this debt possibly be repaid? We can't do it for reasons of our finite nature. God can't do it for reasons of justice. It would require, he says, a being that is both God and man. A being that, being man, can share in that infinite debt. And so be a being of a kind that is justly owing that, but on the other hand, by being divine, actually has the infinite bank account, as it were, to enable the payment of the debt. So in short, the only thing that can restore justice to the universe, to have us absolved of our sin of rejecting God's purposes for us and for the universe, is to have that infinite debt repaid. We can't do it by ourselves. God can't simply do it unilaterally. It would require a being that is both God and man. That is precisely what Jesus Christ was, according to the Christian tradition, a being that is both fully divine and fully human. Anselm says there had to be such a being. If we start with the idea that our own purpose, our own fulfillment, is to be sought not within ourselves, but in relation to a greater being outside of us, in particular in relation to God, then we're led to the conclusion that there had to be a being that was fully human and fully divine. Fully human in order to justly pay that debt, fully divine in the sense of being infinite and capable of paying it. So the basic premise, the basic assumption, the basic thesis of Christianity is something, he says, that a priori has to be true. Once we start with the claim that our own nature, our own purpose, our own fulfillment, our final cause, our ultimate final cause, if you will, lies in community with God. Start there, and Christianity, he says, and its essentials follows directly.